The baddest woman on the planet is BACK, and no one saw this coming. After walking away from the UFC in total chaos, Ronda Rousey just stormed into WWE with fire in her eyes and a score to settle. The crowd's losing it. The locker room's in shock, and trust me, this comeback isn't just a return, it's a statement. What really pushed Ronda to come back, and who's her target now? Stay tuned, because the next 30 seconds will change how you see Ronda Rousey forever. It was supposed to be a celebration, a coronation. The champion, having just defended her title, stood in the center of the ring, soaking in the adoration of thousands. The narrative was written, the show was ending, and then the glass shattered. But it wasn't the sound of a familiar rebel. It was a different sound, a song that had been dormant for years, a theme associated with legitimate, unscripted destruction. The crowd's roar of celebration faltered, morphing into a collective gasp of pure confusion. They didn't understand. This wasn't part of the script. This person wasn't on the roster. She wasn't even supposed to be in the country. But there she was, Ronda Rousey, not smiling, not waving. She looked like she had just walked out of a blizzard. Her eyes were fixed on the ring, bypassing the champion entirely, and staring into the hard camera lens. She was looking at us. The cheers that finally erupted were less about joy and more about pure, unfiltered shock. This wasn't the triumphant return of a beloved hero. This was the arrival of a ghost. The air in the arena turned cold. The champion in the ring, a woman who feared no one, took an involuntary step back. She recognized that look. It was the look of a person who had lost everything and therefore had nothing left to lose. The statement had been made without a single word. Before Ronda even took her first step down the ramp, the internet had already collapsed. It wasn't just a trend, it was a denial love service attack on sports culture. The digital world split into three distinct, warring factions. First, there were the wrestling fans, whose forums and timelines ignited with a mix of elation and pure, cynical rage. They screamed about part-timers, about the spotlight being stolen, about how she hadn't earned it. They saw her as an outsider taking a spot from someone who had clawed their way up for a decade. Then there were the UFC fans. They emerged from the shadows, reopening old wounds. They weren't just shocked. They were confused. They saw this as a betrayal of her real legacy, a desperate move from a fighter who couldn't handle the sting of true defeat. And finally, there was the mainstream media. The talking heads who had buried her career just a few years prior were now scrambling to understand this. Was it a publicity stunt? A cry for help? A brilliant career move? No one had an answer. In the span of 30 seconds, Ronda Rousey had become the most polarizing and fascinating figure in global entertainment, all by simply appearing. The chaos she left behind in the UFC wasn't just about losing, it was about the way she vanished. The media blackout, the silence, the refusal to engage. By returning, she hadn't just re-entered the conversation. She had hijacked it, and every single person with a keyboard was now forced to play by her rules. The silence was broken, and the noise was deafening. The moment the broadcast cut to commercial, the real drama began. Backstage, the atmosphere wasn't celebratory. It was suffocating. The established stars of the locker room, the women who had carried the company through the empty arena era, watched the monitor with a shared, bitter resentment. One woman in particular, the one we'll call the Queen, stood apart from the others. She had built this division. She had scratched and bled for it, main eventing the biggest shows and proving that women's wrestling wasn't just a novelty, but the main attraction, and she had done it without the benefit of a mainstream celebrity name. She saw Ronda's return not as an opportunity, but as a profound insult. In her eyes, Ronda was a tourist. She was a celebrity who had used their ring as a stepping stone, only to leave when it suited her. And now, after failing in her own world, she was back to use them again, to harness their momentum to rebuild her shattered brand. The Queen saw the executives scrambling, their eyes wide with dollar signs, and she felt a cold anger settle in her stomach. This wasn't about competition, it was about respect. And Ronda, by her very presence, was disrespecting the entire foundation the Queen had built. As Ronda was ushered into a private office, passing the locker room she didn't even stop to enter, the Queen made a quiet vow. If the office wasn't going to protect their house, she would. But anger wasn't the only emotion gripping the locker room. Deeper in the back, away from the established veterans, sat the new generation. We'll call one of them the hopeful. She was young, talented, and had just started to find her footing. For her, Ronda Rousey wasn't a peer. She was a legend, a myth. The hopeful grew up watching Ronda break barriers in the UFC. She was the reason the hopeful believed a woman could be a main event attraction. That awe, however, had just curdled into pure, paralyzing fear. It was the realization that the shark tank she had just learned to swim in now contained a great white. All her aspirations, her carefully mapped out plans for the year, the title she was chasing it, all evaporated. How could she possibly compete? How could she get noticed? Ronda's shadow didn't just cover the ring, it blotted out the sun for the entire roster. This fear was different from the Queen's anger. The Queen saw an invader. The hopeful saw an immovable object. She felt her own dreams suddenly become secondary. An afterthought in the blockbuster movie that had just started, the locker room was now fractured. The veterans were preparing for war, sharpening their words and their elbows. The new guard, meanwhile, was just hoping to survive the tidal wave. Ronda hadn't just returned to WWE, she had returned to a complex ecosystem that had evolved without her, and her presence had just poisoned the water. To understand why she returned to the ring, you must first understand why she left the octagon. The explosive UFC drama the world remembers wasn't an argument or a public meltdown. It was something far heavier. It was silence. After her last devastating loss, Ronda Rousey didn't just lose a fight. She lost her identity. The media, the same machine that had built her into an unstoppable goddess, turned on her with a viciousness that was personal. They didn't just critique her technique, they psychoanalyzed her very being. They called her a fraud, a hype job, a frontrunner who shattered the moment she faced adversity. And Ronda, in response, did the one thing her persona was never allowed to do. She hid. She disappeared to a farm, seeking a peace that never came. Because the problem wasn't the media. It was the voice in her own head that agreed with them. Every criticism, every doubt, every what if played on a loop. Her failure wasn't just a public event, it was a private prison. She couldn't train, she couldn't speak, she couldn't even look in the mirror without seeing the person who had let everyone down. This WWE return, this sudden, shocking appearance, wasn't a business decision. It was an act of desperation. It was the only way she knew how to fight back. She couldn't punch the headlines, and she couldn't silence the doubt. But she could step back into an arena, force the world to look at her, and reclaim the one thing they had taken, her narrative. The shockwave of her return didn't stop at the arena. Miles away, on that quiet farm, her family watched the screen with a completely different kind of anxiety. Her husband, himself a former fighter, knew the cost of combat better than anyone. He hadn't just witnessed her public fall, he had been the one to hold her during the private collapse that followed. He had been the one who fielded the calls, who protected her from the world, and who patiently helped her rebuild a sense of self that wasn't tied to a championship belt. He had seen her find a new, quieter purpose in motherhood, in the soil, in the silence. And now he was watching her walk directly back into the storm. He supported her. He always would. But his support was laced with a deep, personal fear. This time, the danger wasn't a perfectly placed head kick. It was the crowd. It was the pressure. It was the insidious nature of fame that demanded she always be the baddest woman on the planet. He feared what would happen if this didn't work, if she stumbled on a promo, or if the fans rejected her. Would it break her again? Would it undo all the fragile peace they had built? While the world debated her motives and her next opponent, her family was left to grapple with a much heavier question. Was this a comeback? Or was it a relapse? And was the price of rewriting her legacy worth the risk of losing herself for good? The first time she spoke, the world was hanging on every word. The executives backstage had a script prepared, a nice, safe, corporate-approved speech. I'm so happy to be back. I'm here for the fans. I'm here to compete. Ronda Rousey, clutching the microphone, her knuckles white, looked at the teleprompter, read the first line, and let out a short, bitter laugh. The crowd hushed. She turned her back to the camera and stared directly at the Queen. "They wanted me to come out here and tell you I missed you," she said, her voice raw. "I didn't. They wanted me to say I'm here for the fans. I'm not. I'm here," she continued, "because this is the only place left where I can legally hurt someone who deserves it. You, ... You stand here and call yourself the queen, but you've never had to build an empire from ashes. You've never had the world spit on you and call you a failure. You've just been ... safe. The word safe hung in the air, a deliberate, poisoned dart. She wasn't just challenging for the title, she was invalidating it. She was turning her own toxic insecurity, her greatest weakness, into her most terrifying weapon. The Queen, for the first time in her career, looked genuinely rattled. This wasn't a wrestling promo, this was a confession. Ronda's target wasn't just the champion, her target was the very idea of safety and the entire system that had protected her. The match was set, the biggest stage of them all, and the pressure began to mount in ways Ronda had never anticipated. When she was in the UFC, the pressure was internal, physical. It was about weight cuts and fight plans. This was different. This was the pressure of performance. The media was no longer just analyzing her fighting style. They were analyzing her popularity. They critiqued her promos. They timed her merchandise sales. They compared her crowd reactions to those of the Queen, who had brilliantly painted Ronda as an arrogant outsider. The baddest woman on the planet moniker, once a source of invincible pride, now felt like a heavy costume she was forced to wear. She was training for a performance, but her body only knew how to train for a fight. The two worlds were colliding within her. The doubts that her husband feared were creeping in. The fans, once just a roar of noise, were now individual voices. She'd hear a single "you suck" from the third row, and it would derail her entire train of thought. She was caught in a paradox. She had returned to silence the noise of her past failure, but the noise of her present was even louder. She was struggling to reconcile the fighter she was with, the sports entertainer she was supposed to be. The closer the match got, the more she unraveled, realizing that the enemy wasn't the Queen. The enemy was the expectation of the crowd. It was the final press conference before the historic match. The tension was palpable. Ronda was in her old fight week mode, sullen, angry, wearing her scowl-like armor. The Queen, by contrast, was relaxed, confident, and dressed impeccably. She was in her element. The media asked their questions, which Ronda met with one-word answers. Finally, the Queen motioned for the microphone. She didn't look at Ronda. She looked directly into the main camera, speaking to the entire world. "We all know what this is," she began, her voice calm and cutting. "This isn't about my championship. This isn't about this company. This is about your failure." Ronda tensed, ready to leap across the table. But the Queen held up a hand. "You're not here to beat me, Ronda. You're here because you need millions of people to chant your name, just to prove to yourself that you're not the fraud the world said you were. You're still fighting the ghost of your last loss. You're not a fighter. You're a validation addict." "And this Sunday," she said, finally turning to look Ronda in the eyes, "I'm not just going to beat you. I'm going to set you free by proving to you, once and for all, that you just don't belong here." There was no comeback, there was no witty retort, because for the first time, someone had said the quiet part out loud, and Ronda knew it was true. The match happened. The pyrotechnics exploded, the crowd roared. A winner was declared, but none of it mattered. The real story, the one no one saw, happened 2 hours after the show went off the air. Ronda Rousey, having avoided all media, all executives, and all her peers, walked back out onto the entrance ramp. The arena was empty, save for the cleaning crew. It was dark and quiet. She walked down the ramp and stood in the center of the ring, the ropes still smelling of sweat and smoke. She stood there for a long time. Maybe she won. Maybe she lost. It was irrelevant. The Queen's words had been a key. The statement she had come to make wasn't for the fans. It wasn't for the Queen. It wasn't even for the media that had buried her. It was for the ghost in the octagon. The explosive UFC drama wasn't about losing a fight. It was about hiding from the world in shame. This whole comeback, this entire chaotic, painful, public return. This was the statement. The statement was that she was no longer hiding. She had faced the roar of the crowd, the hatred of her peers, and the truth of her own failure, and she hadn't run. She had endured. The comeback wasn't about winning a title. It was about proving she could show up at all. And as she stood in the silent, empty arena, she realized the baddest woman on the planet was finally at peace. She was free.